Welcome back. Our conversation continues now with Eliana Johnson, Washington editor for National Review, and we're following that breaking news just came out of the Supreme Court, that ruling on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, commonly known, the justices upholding the subsidies in states that did not establish their own exchanges. This was a major contention by conservatives opposed to that law. Our Scott Thuman is live outside the Supreme Court, ready to provide us his perspective on the reaction there outside the courthouse. Scott?
Yeah, Mike, it's interesting because I had a talk immediately after this case was heard before the Supreme Court, and I talked with who's now the former Healthcare Secretary, Kathleen Sebelius, and she was telling me, look, this is all a matter of semantics, that the right, or those who were against the healthcare law, were really hanging their argument on those four words, established by the state, meaning, in other words, that the federal subsidies could only go to people who had used exchanges that were established by the state. It's only 16 states. So she said clearly in this 900-plus page law that was written across the street by Congress, they didn't intend for it to be so separated. So she said it was all in a technicality. Whether or not that's what convinced the 9 justices, we don't know. I need to read through the entire ruling. But the bottom line is they supported what they would claim is the intent of the law. And had they not, you would have seen perhaps 6 million people instantly who would have lost some sort of federal subsidies. They would have lost some money and then therefore not been able to afford the health care. There were CBO estimates that they might have seen their health care jump by $3,300, something that they could no longer afford, because you're talking mostly about lower and middle income families. So you had 16 states that were really kind of safe from losing their subsidies. You had 34 who were in danger of losing them. And I think that the Supreme Court looked at the overall package, the intent of that law as written, and decided that this was the way that they needed to rule.
We should remind our viewers this was a 6-3 decision with Chief Justice John Roberts and Anthony Kennedy joining the more liberal justices on the court. Scott, can you set the scene for us? What was the reaction? How big is the crowd out there today?
Yeah, and we will, and you're going to have to bear with us because we're going to kind of pan through a bunch of equipment here. But as we do that, I just want to tell you that it's kind of called the running of the interns. You have the interns that come running out with the rulings as they're handed down, because it's not, you remember, there aren't television cameras in the courtroom, so it's handed down via paper, and they run out. And once an intern ran out and everyone kind of looked at the first ruling, realized that it was indeed King versus Burwell, there was a pretty big eruption from a bunch of ACA supporters, healthcare supporters, Obamacare supporters as you would call them, who've been gathering here for the past couple of hours. And once again, forgive us for going through the equipment and all the other journalists here, but you'll see those signs, the red and blue signs, and each one represents a state. So, for example, you see AZ, Arizona, they're saying 266,000 still covered. They're talking about the people that would have been affected by this ruling and needed for it to be upheld. Now, here's the thing. You do have a pretty interesting CBO estimate that came out, Mike, that talked about how it actually is adding to the deficit, and that's what the GOP had been holding on to, saying that this is bad in so many ways. But there wasn't a plan B, at least not publicly. And, Mike, I know you've reported on this and talked about this. It was very fascinating to watch this Obama administration say, well, there isn't really any plan B. They might have had one behind closed doors and just not wanted to let that out. But we didn't know what was going to happen, other than some Republicans on the Hill said, look, if this rules against the Affordable Care Act, and suddenly you have millions of people who are affected and it hurts their pocketbooks, we're going to come up with some sort of legislation to help ease that and integrate the system with health care and the insurers to kind of lift some of the burden. But had the ruling gone the other way, it would have been very, very interesting to see how many people would have actually been affected and what would have happened across the street on Capitol Hill.
Scholars, journalists, legal experts now parsing through every word of that decision that came down. 6-3, Chief Justice Roberts joining Kennedy and the more liberal justices. Scott, let me get your take on that, the numbers, because 6-3, that does send a message about the divide of the court, and more than just 5-4 coming out in this decision upholding the Affordable Care Act. How much does that matter to this ruling, to this White House?
Well, in the end, as long as you get a win, it doesn't matter what the scoreboard tally truly was when it comes from the Supreme Court. But you raise a really good point, because 6-3 is a relatively definitive answer from the 9 behind me. I think here's the argument you're going to see written up in editorials, and it's going to be whether or not the Supreme Court continues to take into consideration public opinion and the shift in our social society and structure, because so many times they say, look, this is all about the law. It's about what we believe is legal and right, constitutional. But there's also this continual seepage of sentiment. Are we doing what's best for people these days? The times have changed. Look, it wasn't terribly long ago that interracial marriage was still outlawed, and that's something that may come into consideration with the other big case we're waiting to hear. But yeah, Mike, I think you raise a good point. These justices, they're normal people too, to some degree. I mean, they're out amongst all of us. They see the rallies, they hear people, they read, they have neighbors, and they're influenced. And there is a significant chance that they have seen that this is a changing of the guard, that the times are changing. And when you look at public opinion polls, and that so many states now are in favor of one measure over another, that has to play some sort of factor. It may not be overwhelming, but it has to be part of their psyche.
Scott, I want to bring Eliana Johnson from the National Review back into our conversation, have her join our conversation, and get your take on Chief Justice Roberts, again, joining with the more liberal justices, as well as Anthony Kennedy, often seen as a swing vote. You have to imagine a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans not happy to see him taking this stance.
You know, I think most Republicans really thought he would use this as an opportunity to sort of redeem himself. And make up for the decision upholding the whole of the law from a few years back. And he did not do that. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how Republicans as a whole react to this, not only in Congress, where they have the option of going to reconciliation to repeal this law and going on record as being entirely against it, but also the presidential candidates. What do they say we should do now? So the Republican Party as a whole, and the presidential candidates in particular, now it's on them to respond.
Scott, Eliana brings up a good point. How do you think the 2016 field will react to this?
Well, look, it's been a mantra from the GOP since this law was passed that they wanted to repeal it. And I think you're going to hear from some of those hardcore conservatives and even some of the moderates that they want to continue that path. Now, that path is certainly hit a dead end to some degree, I guess you could argue. What their position forward would be having to convince members on the Hill to somehow alter, create, amend laws that are already on the books. It would be very, very difficult. That also, though, gives some of those Republican candidates cover, because think about it. Now they can go from Iowa to New Hampshire and they can argue, we're against it, this is a tragedy, it hurts America, it kills jobs, people aren't getting 40 hours a week because employers don't want to have to cover them. They can argue that as long as they want until they're blue in the face, and there won't be a repercussion because it's a hypothetical that they probably can't alter. So yes, you have cover as a Republican, you can rally your base, and I don't want to be blanket by saying Republicans. We have, 14, 13 now candidates, with Bobby Jindal getting in yesterday, so I don't want to speak for all of them. But for those on the far right who have been against this from day one, yeah, they'll continue to argue that, but it somewhat becomes a moot point.
Scott Duman live with us at the Supreme Court. I know you have a job to do. You want to get reaction from folks out there. Before we let you go, Scott, are you seeing opponents of the Affordable Care Act out there protesting?
No. Typically we'll just see a smattering of them. The loudest voices have always been, over the past 6 months here, have been those who are in favor of keeping the ACA the way it is, and those who are pushing for the constitutional right to marry when it comes to gay marriage. Those are the loudest voices. We do see some in the background who are against those two measures, and they will speak to us, but we haven't seen a lot of them out here today. It's always kind of a circus. What was interesting, Mike, I'll just point out quickly, is I was out here on Monday, and there weren't a lot of people out here. There were more journalists than groups or activists. Today we saw a huge collection of people with Affordable Care Act signs, and you always wonder, they had to have known that a clerk tipped off someone who tipped off someone, and suddenly it spread, because we saw a much larger crowd today than we've seen in the past couple of weeks as people waited for these rulings to come down.
Very interesting observation there. Scott Duman, thanks so much for that update from the court, this historic major ruling